The fear he inspired wasn't born of physical dominance. When Michael Jordan, basketball's ultimate predator, admits to fearing another player, the statement carries a different weight. It is a story that goes beyond mere statistics or televised highlights. For what opponents truly dreaded wasn't Bird's athleticism, it was the chilling precision of his words. Larry would articulate the exact manner in which he intended to score, and then he would simply execute it, leaving defenders powerless to intervene. And this wasn't some myth, it was a truth acknowledged by a pantheon of his peers, Magic, Dominique, Payton, and even Kobe. Which leads to a fundamental question. Among a league of extraordinary athletes, what was the source of Larry Bird's uniquely terrifying power? To read Larry Bird's list of accomplishments aloud is to encounter a career that borders on the unbelievable. Consider it. 3 championships and 3 consecutive MVP awards, a feat previously achieved only by titans like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. 12 All-Star appearances, Rookie of the Year, the full measure of greatness. On paper, he was the archetype of a generational talent who defined an era. But therein lies the paradox. Bird never projected the image of the basketball superhuman that he was. He didn't possess the explosive speed of Jordan or the aerial grace of Dominique, and no one was nominating him for a dunk contest. And yet, by the mid-1980s, any serious discussion about the greatest player in the world had to include his name at the very top. The strangeness of it all is only magnified by his origins. He came from French Lick, Indiana, a small, working-class town where basketball served as more than just a game. It was the sole source of communal pride. They called him the Hick from French Lick, a label he chose to embrace rather than escape. He was raised in a large family with limited means, and the basketball court was his one true sanctuary. Consequently, by the time he arrived at Indiana State, his purpose was greater than just personal achievement. He was single-handedly pulling a program from obscurity into the bright glare of the national spotlight. Michigan State is in control. Donley in the backcourt. Many believe the key to defeating Michigan State is to establish an early lead when the Spartans are ahead. That 1979 NCAA championship game against Magic Johnson's Michigan State is still counted among the most viewed college basketball broadcasts ever, and one must consider that Bird did not emerge victorious that night. Magic's team was simply too formidable, yet the very fact he had guided Indiana State to that stage was astonishing. Before him, the Sycamores were completely unknown. In an instant, they were the headline story for every sports desk in the nation. That game was more than compelling television. It was the dawn of one of the most significant rivalries in the annals of sport. Even in defeat, Bird's legend only expanded. As the world understood, this was no temporary marvel. When the Celtics finally acquired him, the timing was perfect. They were coming off a season of just 29 wins in 1979, one of the bleakest in their storied history. Then Bird arrived as a rookie, and the team's fortunes reversed to 61 victories. That represents a 32-game swing, driven by one man, and he didn't require any time to acclimate. He immediately averaged 21 points, 10 rebounds, and nearly 5 assists. Level brings it down. You see 2 seconds, 1, and the world champion of Boston. Most rookies need years to adjust to the professional level, but Larry appeared with the authority of someone who had commanded the league for a decade. What is often overlooked is the profound effect he had on his teammates. Players like Dave Cowens and Tiny Archibald, whose careers seemed to be winding down, were suddenly reinvigorated. Then, Red Auerbach capitalized, engineering the trade for Robert Parrish, drafting Kevin McHale, and later adding Dennis Johnson while retaining Cedric Maxwell. Within a very short time, Boston was not merely competitive again. They had become the most feared team in professional basketball. By Bird's second season, they were holding the championship trophy. For any true student of the game, that progression is almost impossible to comprehend. Rookies are not supposed to rebuild dynasties, but Larry did right before our eyes. Initially, the sentiment from around the league was one of pure respect. His peers respected the numbers, the unyielding toughness, and the fact that he had restored the Celtics to relevance. But respect operates on the surface. Fear runs much deeper. Fear is the internal battle you've already lost before the game begins, all because of the man standing on the other side of the court. Those first few years built the foundation, the resume, the underdog narrative, the stunning revival in Boston, but the true fear came later, when Bird began to audibly predict his own shots, compelling defenders to simply stand and watch him make good on his word. When people speak of Bird's trash talk, it wasn't the standard fare of, "you can't guard me." That's a common refrain. What distinguished him was his clinical specificity. He would detail his intentions and then he would fulfill them. It wasn't an insult, it was a premonition. That was the psychological weapon that broke so many of the men who faced him. If an opponent tells you he's about to make a jump shot from the wing and then proceeds to sink it in your face, you haven't just been beaten on the scoreboard. You've been defeated mentally. And that precisely was Bird's specialty. Take, for instance, Reggie Miller's rookie season. He's like, "I am the best shooter this game." And he's announcing it for the entire world to hear. I just thought, my God, he's putting me on blast in my own house with all my family and friends watching. There has never been a better shooter in the history of this sport. Reggie Miller spent his youth looking up to Larry Bird as a hero. Then, one day, he found himself standing on the same court, and Bird didn't hesitate. He walked right up to the rookie and said, "So you're the kid they picked instead of me." The line, of course, made no sense. Miller was drafted in '87, Bird came into the league in '78, but that was the genius of it. Larry wasn't concerned with facts. His only goal was to plant a seed of doubt in his opponent's mind. For a young player like Reggie, that was all it took. Bird followed it up by dismantling Indiana, shot after clinical shot, as if to prove some unspoken truth. Miller has recounted that story countless times because it was the moment of realization Larry wasn't merely a great scorer. He was a strategist who transformed every contest into a battle of wills. And then you have Shawn Kemp, whose own encounter with Bird might be the most humbling of all. From the very beginning of the game, he told me exactly what was coming. And he wasn't lying. He made sure I knew. Before the game even started, he just looked over and shook his head at me. He said, "Man, this is going to be a long night for you." So what did he end up with? I believe he dropped, what was it? I think he hung 46 on me. Now, Kemp was this explosive, young, athletic marvel, a walking, breathing highlight reel. Kemp could fly, while Bird was famously earthbound. On paper, it was a physical mismatch in Kemp's favor, but Bird never had to win with pure athleticism. Kemp has shared the account on his own terms. During his first year, Bird sized him up, announced exactly what he was about to do, and from what spot on the floor. And then, inevitably, he drained the very shot he described. Kemp would later confess that it rattled him, because how can anyone possibly guard against that? You're a rookie, trying to establish your place, and this veteran is calmly narrating your demise. This leads to perhaps the most legendary story of all, the three-point contest. What makes this tale iconic is that it didn't even happen during a game. He walked into the locker room and asked, "So who's coming in second? What was your finish?" He got me. He was better that day. Simple as that. And make no mistake, that wasn't humor. That was a declaration to the entire room that the competition was a foregone conclusion. He then stepped onto the court, sank 11 consecutive shots in the final round, and claimed the title, all without ever removing his warm-up jacket. It was an act of pure showmanship. But the unsettling truth is that, for him, it wasn't a show. He genuinely believed he was the greatest shooter on the planet, and he proceeded to prove it in front of all his peers. This is why his words carried so much weight. It was never just talk. Talk is cheap. What dismantled opponents was the fact that Bird's words were promises, and he wielded them with surgical precision. The moment he declared his intent, you were already defeated, mentally bracing for the inevitable, your mind consumed by it. He was never known for his explosive speed off the dribble, but when you hesitate for even a fraction of a second, still replaying his prediction in your head, the ball is already in the air. That was the source of the fear he inspired. It was about more than just the final score. It was the realization that he had defeated you on two fronts. First, inside your own mind, and then on the scoreboard. Of course, not everyone was a believer in the Bird legend. Dennis Rodman, a man who rarely offered praise, remained unconvinced. He famously claimed Bird wasn't a difficult assignment, just a solid fundamental player who happened to be a good shooter. It was a classic Rodman move, an attempt to deconstruct the myth. He even took it a step further, suggesting that in the modern game, Larry Bird would probably be playing in Europe. But in a way, Rodman's critique inadvertently supported the very core of Bird's greatness. The fear Bird instilled didn't come from flash or explosive athleticism. It came from his ability to transform fundamental basketball into an unstoppable force of nature. For a defender like Rodman, who fed on chaos and thrived on disruption, Bird presented a unique challenge. His mental warfare wasn't built on the unexpected. He would defeat you with a simple, methodical play you had witnessed countless times before. The difference was, he would announce it beforehand, and you were still powerless to stop it. This was the foundation of his psychological dominance. He turned predictability into a weapon. Each called shot, each fulfilled prophecy, strengthened the narrative. Once Larry Bird had determined the outcome of a play, the result was already written. It was fate masquerading as bravado. And the moment his opponents began to accept it as truth, the contest was decided long before he released his shot. And his influence wasn't limited to rookies and journeymen. When the topic of Larry Bird comes up, it's the icons of the game who have the most compelling tales to tell. Consider Magic Johnson. Their rivalry arguably defined the modern era of basketball. Their collision in the 1979 NCAA championship, one of the most viewed collegiate games in history, was only the beginning. It spilled over into the NBA, where the Celtics and Lakers rivalry became the very pulse of the league. Magic has always acknowledged that Bird was more than an adversary. He was the standard that forced him to elevate his own game. Magic embodied the spectacle of Showtime, all style and tempo. But whenever he faced Bird, he understood there was a force on the opposing side, capable of grinding the game to a halt and defeating him with cold, calculated precision. In the 1980s, their matchups transcended sport. They were cultural events, and Magic Johnson has stated unequivocally that Bird was the most formidable opponent he ever encountered. But you need not take my word for it. The evidence speaks for itself. That boy, he can play, man. He turned it out. Then you have Dominique Wilkins. The 1988 Eastern Conference semifinals are etched in the memory of the league. A contest where he and Bird traded blows, shot for shot. Dominique scored 47 points. Bird countered with 34. But the box score tells only half the story. The true narrative was in the timing. In the final quarter, Bird scored 20 points, and each basket landed with the weight of a dagger. Dominique himself would later describe it as the greatest game ever contested between two forwards. Even in defeat, he acknowledged a fundamental truth. Bird possessed a quality that set him apart. That rivalry became legendary not because one man broke the other, but because both ascended to a higher plane and Bird emerged with the victory. For a player like Dominique, who was fueled by immense self-belief, to offer that kind of deference tells you everything about the respect Bird commanded in the moment. The perspective from Gary Payton was of an entirely different nature. Known as the Glove, Payton was notoriously relentless, a constant voice in his opponent's ear. But even he admitted that Bird's brand of trash talk operated on a superior level. Payton recalled his shock that Bird's words were never just empty noise, they were unnervingly specific. He described it as simultaneously disrespectful and beautiful, precisely because it was more than just a psychological tactic. It was a statement of confidence in his own execution. Even Kobe Bryant, whose career began after Bird's had ended, gave him profound credit. Kobe, an obsessive student of basketball history, dissected Bird's game with the same focus he applied to Jordan's. He spoke of learning how Bird could manipulate defenders, use his frame to engineer space, and move with an absolute economy of motion. I would always ask questions and try to learn as much as I could, right? Kobe went so far as to name Bird as a model for his own legendary footwork and patience. Coming from a technician like Kobe, that is the highest form of praise. When you gather all these testimonies from Magic, Dominique, Payton, and Kobe, a clear and consistent image comes into focus. They represent different eras and different styles, yet they all arrive at the same conclusion. Bird wasn't feared for his athleticism. He was feared because the greatest players of his time were utterly powerless to stop him from doing exactly what he declared he was going to do. And to put a final point on it, the greatest of all time held nothing back. Bird's aura of intimidation wasn't just about his actions. It was that he would tell you exactly how he was going to defeat you. That was Michael Jordan, confirming the very essence of this story. You have to remember, when Jordan entered the league in 1984, he was a phenom of pure flash, athleticism, and raw skill. But the Bulls organization was nowhere near prepared to contend with the era's Titans. And the most imposing of those Titans was, without question, Larry Bird's Celtics. Every time a young MJ stepped onto the Boston Garden parquet, he wasn't just facing a roster of Hall of Famers. He was entering Bird's personal theater of dominance. The Celtics dismantled Chicago with regularity, and Bird personally ensured that Jordan felt the full weight of every lesson learned. Jordan might score 30, 40, sometimes even 50 points, but Boston would still walk away the victors. And Bird would make it painfully clear that individual numbers are meaningless if the scoreboard doesn't reflect them. That was the core lesson. It is not enough to be great. It is about imposing your will upon the game itself. The 1986 playoffs offer the perfect illustration. The first 2 points of the game for Larry Bird. The Celtics have an 11-point lead. Jordan on the rebound. In Game 2 of that series, Jordan delivered one of the most iconic performances in NBA history, scoring 63 points against the Celtics. It was such a masterful display that the hostile Garden crowd gave him a standing ovation. The moment was simply unreal. In an interview, Bird famously said this of Jordan's game that night: "That wasn't Michael Jordan out there, it was God disguised as Michael Jordan." Consider the weight of that statement. The undisputed best player in the world at the time witnessed a 23-year-old set a new playoff scoring record against his team and elevated him to divine status. But here is the critical detail. Even on Jordan's most transcendent night, the Celtics still won. Bird finished with 36 points, 12 rebounds, and 8 assists. It wasn't enough for him to simply acknowledge Jordan's brilliance. He had to prove that basketball is ultimately decided by the final outcome. That confrontation stayed with Jordan, because if you closely examine the mental fortress MJ would later build for himself, the psychological warfare, the way he converted every perceived insult into fuel, you can trace its origins back to Bird. Jordan studied how Bird infiltrated his opponents' minds, absorbed that methodology, and weaponized it for his own reign. He would tell you he planned to score 40, and then he would score 55. He would invent slights and grudges simply to sharpen his own anger and amplify his opponent's anxiety. People often credit Kobe for his intense study of Jordan, but the truth is that Jordan himself learned many of his mind games from observing how Bird systematically dismantled people. And when you truly trace that lineage of greatness, the connection is remarkable. Michael Jordan projected an aura of fearlessness, but a subtle shift occurred in his voice. Whenever he spoke of Larry Bird, it wasn't bravado, nor was it disrespect. It was pure, unadulterated reverence, tinged with a palpable sense of caution. And when the consensus greatest of all time concedes that feeling, the discussion is effectively over. But the true nature of his dominance wasn't rooted in a single obvious skill. It was a 3-part symphony of execution he conducted night after night. The first movement was his shot making, defined by a compact, repeatable release. His equilibrium was unshakable, and his effective distance extended from the mid-range all the way past the 3-point arc. The second movement was his footwork, a mastery of subtle deceptions, using pump fakes and pivots so understated they would leave defenders paralyzed with indecision. The third and final movement was his passing. He would masterfully draw in a help defender, only to exploit the rotation with a pass that left his opponent looking utterly responsible for the breakdown. When these 3 elements converged, Bird wasn't merely accumulating points. He was orchestrating foregone conclusions. It's why his game was so often described as simply inevitable. Paradoxically, this very predictability became his most potent weapon. Opponents knew precisely what moves he preferred, but that knowledge itself became the trap. A couple of legendary performances perfectly encapsulate this entire methodology. The game against Portland, where he famously decided to play almost exclusively with his left hand, is a prime example. Larry announced to us in the press, "Tomorrow's the last night of the trip. I'm going to play this one with my left hand." He was not joking. Bird's self-assurance was so absolute that he altered his dominant hand mid-game, sinking left-handed layups and jumpers en route to an astonishing triple-double. It was undeniable proof that when he claimed he could dictate the terms of engagement, it was far more than simple trash talk. The other iconic moment is the game winner over Xavier McDaniel. Bird calmly informed McDaniel of the exact sequence that was about to unfold, where he would receive the pass, the number of dribbles he would take, and the precise spot the shot would be released from. And then he brought his prophecy to life. But if his greatness was built on rhythm and repetition, what happened on the nights that rhythm was broken, when his shots refused to fall, or when injury began to rob him of his foundation? This is the chapter of Bird's story that often goes unspoken. Because despite the folklore of him calling his shots and delivering, he was not 100% infallible. There were evenings when the bravado fell flat, when the decisive shot would rim out and the bold predictions would dissolve into silence. Those moments were essential, for they served as a reminder that Larry Bird was not a mythical figure. He was a human being. What truly began to ground him, however, were the injuries. Through the late 80s and early 90s, his own body became his adversary. A chronic back condition made it an ordeal for him just to sit on the bench, let alone endure 40 minutes of NBA basketball. A series of surgeries and stints on the sideline began to erode the edges of his supremacy. While flashes of his old brilliance remained, you could almost see the immense physical toll each one exacted. And still, those failures never managed to tarnish the legend. In fact, they seemed to imbue the nights he succeeded with an even greater sense of significance. Because when that rhythm was undeniable, when the lights of the Garden illuminated that iconic floor, the aura that surrounded him transformed into something transcendent, something beyond mere talent. As Dominique Wilkins once noted, facing Bird in the Garden was a different beast entirely. Your opponent wasn't just him. You were contending with the crowd, with the floor, and with the weight of all that history. That building imbued him with another level of strength, and that brings us to the next layer of the narrative. Because the challenge wasn't just facing Larry Bird, the player. It was contending with the Boston Garden, the championship banners, and the physical edge his teammates relentlessly enforced. Boston wasn't merely a stage for his talent, it was a force multiplier. The old Garden bore no resemblance to the polished arenas of today. It was intimate and suffocating, the air hanging so heavy you would sweat before you even began to warm up. The parquet floor was famously riddled with dead spots, and the Celtics knew the location of every single one. Visiting teams despised it, but Bird made it his sanctuary. That floor, those baskets, that deafening crowd, they were all integral components of his home court dominance. And then there were the fans. Boston's faithful weren't simply loud, they were merciless. Every made Celtics basket was met with a roar that seemed to shake the foundations, while every opponent's miss was greeted with a chorus of derision. And if you were the unfortunate soul Bird had decided to target that night, they would make sure you heard about it from the opening tip to the final buzzer. This was all amplified by the very culture of the Celtics. Red Auerbach constructed that dynasty on a bedrock of intimidation, mental fortitude, and an unwavering expectation of winning. Bird's teammates, McHale, Parrish, Dennis Johnson, Maxwell were not just supporting cast members, they were protectors who guaranteed that no opponent could physically impose their will on Larry. Any attempt to get rough with him meant answering to a front line that would deliver retribution. This is why Boston amplified the psychological warfare. To play against Bird in the Garden meant you weren't just defending a single superstar. You were battling the floor, the history, the crowd, and a roster that had victory woven into its very DNA. It's hardly surprising that opposing teams felt defeated before they even stepped onto the court. And this reality invites a compelling question. How would Larry Bird's particular style of intimidation translate if he were dropped into the modern NBA? The answer opens up a dialogue that might be unexpected. The modern game is a blur of motion, a landscape defined by relentless pace, impossible length, and suffocating, switch-heavy defenses. And yet, Larry Bird's game feels like an anchor in that storm. A fundamental truth built to withstand any era. A 6'9" forward with visionary court sense, a lethal deep-range shot, and the ability to dictate the entire rhythm of an offense, it's the very blueprint of a modern superstar. But what truly separated Bird from the spectacle of today's stars was the substance of his greatness. It wasn't found in explosive dunks or dazzling dribble combinations. The psychological warfare he waged wasn't broadcast through cryptic tweets or fleeting digital stories. It was delivered face-to-face in the heat of the moment. And the misconception about his methodical game was that it was never about being slow. He commanded the court at his own tempo, a deliberate rhythm that dismantled defenders, much like the critique Luka Doncic faces today from opponents who still cannot break his pace. Bird possessed this same mastery decades prior, armed with a purer jump shot and a psychological edge sharpened to a razor's point. The notion that he couldn't compete in this era reveals a misunderstanding of what defines dominance, the very same qualities of intellect and skill we see in masters like Jokic and Durant. So, if you placed Bird in the league today, would he merely hold his own? The question isn't about survival. That was never his concern. He would orchestrate, he would command, he would thrive. The enduring question is whether any era, any defense, could truly contain the force of a prime Larry Bird. And if you pause at that question, then you understand the weight of his legacy, a conversation that remains timeless.